Hello, welcome to the second panel of the day, which will be about gender and memory. I would like to thank the speakers for their presence. First, we have Ana Viegas from Christ University, India. Then we have, I don't know, I'm not sure yet, but we have Cecilia Carril from the National University of Litoral, Argentina. Lucas Martinelli from the National Scientific and Technical Research Council, Argentina. And finally, we have the independent scholar GVGK Tang. You have 15 minutes to present your communications. In the end, we will have a Q&A, so the viewers or myself can ask some questions. Thank you all for your presence. I think we can start now with Ana Viegas, with the communication, film, memory, and women's historical recovery, analyzing Women in Gold and Wild Nights with Emily. The floor is yours.
Thank you, André. And thank you for introducing me and my paper. Let me just share my screen. Is my screen visible? Yes? Okay, yes. Great. So I'm going to get into my presentation without further ado. So my paper is situated in the broad set of relations among memory, history, and cinema, which have been extensively theorized. More particularly, I am concerned with the relation between memory and cinema in two aspects. First, the way the structures of memory may be adapted within cinema. And second, the way cinema itself functions as a vehicle or a form of cultural memory, where cultural memory refers to the way a particular social or cultural group commemorates its past through its cultural practices and presentations. The idea that cinema is in a position to either confirm and reify certain dominant narratives about the past, or is in a position to critique and challenge them, particularly when this involves prioritizing alternative or more marginalized stories. In terms of this latter aspect, my specific concern is with the possibilities of cinema engaging with the historicization, or more specifically, the recovery of women. The understanding here being that within mainstream narratives, both in terms of history and memory, women have largely been left out owing to masculinist frameworks of approach. In order to engage with this problem, I've selected two English language films, namely Women in Gold, directed by Simon Curtis, and Wild Nights with Emily, directed by Madeleine Olnek, both of which extensively make use of memory as a narrative strategy therein. Women in Gold essentially dramatizes one of the most high-profile art restitution cases in Austria in the late 20th century and early 21st century. This basically dealt with the return of the portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer, the Woman in Gold painting, which can be seen in the background of my film poster here. It was stolen by the Nazis from a Jewish family in Austria, namely the Bloch-Bauers. Now, this entire story is told from the perspective of Maria Altmann, who is one of the daughters of the Bloch-Bauer family, and it is told primarily through her memories in the form of flashbacks, which essentially becomes the narrative strategies structured along the functioning of memory in this film. I am specifically concerned with the way Adele herself, the subject of the portrait, figures in Maria's memories in a context where she's otherwise disappeared from regular narratives. In Wild Nights with Emily, we have a biopic of a very famous American poet, of course, Emily Dickinson. However, she is mainly remembered in terms of a highly reductive image, which has now been proven to be quite, well, reductive. In terms of being a recluse, someone who locked herself up in the room and wrote thousands of poems and never showed them to anyone, essentially an eccentric, lovelorn, lonely spinster. This film purports to offer a counter image to this, and does so by prioritizing the memories of Mabel Loomis Todd, who ironically enough was actually one of Emily's first editors and publishers, and is also partly responsible for this highly reductive image that has lasted almost until the present day. The film, however, deals with her memories quite ironically by countering them every so often. So in one scene, you will have Mabel talking about Emily in the past, and in the next scene, you will have a scene set in the past wherein Emily is doing almost the exact opposite thing. So my objective in this paper is to analyze the role of the memory tropes that I identified here, both in terms of the representation of the central figures within the film and in terms of historicization of women more broadly. My argument is that the use of memory tropes, in this film illuminates various facets of memory's role in women's historical erasure and recovery as processes that are sort of engaged with or represented within the film itself. Simultaneously, by doing this, the films themselves are able to bring about a kind of recovery of these two central figures for audiences in the present at the level of reframing cultural memory. Now, in terms of my conceptual framework, one of the primary concepts that I've drawn upon is cinememory, suggested by Michael Martin and Dave Wall, wherein they designate certain films as cinememory, wherein the fluid dynamics of memory are structured alongside the generic conventions of the history film genre in order to serve some kind of broad ideological purpose. They mainly do this by analyzing the tropes of memory within the film, wherein tropes of memory basically involves the narrative, thematic, and aesthetic strategies that are based on the way memory functions or the various kinds of memories that do exist within the film itself. So I will be adopting a similar methodology in my analysis of these films. The other concepts that are very relevant to my interpretation include the concepts of personal, social, and cultural memory, as well as the concepts of erasure and recovery, which are taken from the ambit of women's history as a discipline more broadly, while also taking into consideration intersectionality, as well as the role of memory in both erasure and recovery. Moving straight to my analysis, I first look into the erasure of Adele and Emily Dickinson, as I've mentioned, primarily in the way the films are able to bring this erasure across. Here, erasure doesn't necessarily mean that these women have been written out of history. Rather, we see that their erasure is inextricably entangled with the way they have been rendered culturally significant, because both these figures are indeed very culturally significant within Austrian and American culture, respectively. So you see that in both of these, they become positioned within the social and cultural narratives of these cultures in a way wherein large aspects of their experiences, of their identities are completely erased in order to render them more acceptable within the culture in which they're situated. And of course, this is something that the film, through the use of memory tropes, engages with extensively. So in Women in Gold, you see how Adele's portrait was stolen, and eventually how it is transformed into an Austrian symbol. In doing so, what becomes apparent is that even while Adele's image is privileged and prioritized within Austrian culture, she herself disappears. Her name, Adele Bloch-Bauer, is dropped, and with it, her Jewish identity, as well as the history of her situation within Fin de siècle Viennese society and the Jewish community therein completely disappears. I've also drawn upon two other cultural considerations in order to analyze this erasure. One in terms of the muse, where Adele, as the muse of the male artist Gustav Klimt, is essentially marginalized, and also Austria's post-war narrative, wherein they saw themselves first as victims, and second, they attempted to sort of establish a history for themselves that was independent of their association with Germany, with a lot of these cultural artifacts being co-opted as symbols of this rich history. I've also, in terms of Wild Nights with Emily, I've already talked about how Emily has been seen in terms of a highly reductive image, which in turn signals how her cultural significance is wrapped up with the way she has been erased. Now, in the film, this image is traced to Mabel Loomis Todd, as I've already mentioned, which in turn enables the film to engage with the contingencies of personal memory alongside social and cultural memory that is sort of dealt with in Women in Gold. Here we see how the contingencies of memory in terms of Mabel's own personal agenda, structuring the way she narrativizes the past, that is seen. And on the other hand, we also see the various ideological considerations relevant to her context, 19th century America, coming across in the way she narrativizes Emily. Again, these considerations include the archetypal image of the poetess, which functions similarly to the archetypal image of the muse in the case of Adele. Here, this involves certain stereotypes about the American poetess, who on one hand is seen as secondary to the male poet, and on the other is seen as an oddity in terms of womanhood more normatively. So this stereotype also becomes a kind of expectation for audiences, allowing Mabel to capitalize on such an image and give it to an audience that was already poised to embrace it. You also need to take into consideration queer erasure, because Emily is now known to be possibly queer. And this is something that has been glossed over in her history, which the film, of course, tries to sort of correct. And the context of queer erasure in this case implies that during 19th century America, even though queerness was very prevalent, it was expunged from historical records. And this is something that Mabel very actively does in terms of her narrativization. Moving to the next section of my analysis, I look into the possibilities of recovery via the use of memory tropes in these films. Now, at the first level, we can see a kind of empirical recovery to the extent that's possible in film, wherein the films, through the use of memory tropes, try and highlight certain aspects of these women's experiences in the past that can in turn be understood by the audiences. So in Women in Gold, you see through the use of flashbacks how Adele emerges on one hand as an independent woman, and on the other as a Jew, in terms of her connection to her family at the heart of Viennese society. This is particularly in the last scene, which is the image that I have presented here, wherein this is the scene at the very end of the film. It is also a flashback scene, and it occurs after Maria has won back the portrait. So you can see how Adele is being restored to the center, to the heart of her community. And you can also see in terms of the image hanging behind her, how her identity and her history is reinvested in that image, no longer allowed to function as a kind of empty cultural symbol. In terms of Wild Nights with Emily, the kind of recovery that occurs takes place through the ironic contradiction of Mabel's narrativization, wherein, of course, one, she emerges as possibly queer, as evident from the image, particularly in terms of her relationship with her sister-in-law, Susan Dickinson. She also emerges as a poet who did not hide her poetry from other people, but actively sought publication. The reason she was thwarted was because of the masculinist frameworks of literary publishing at the time. However, my analysis of recovery does not end here. I take it a step further, contending that the concept that the particular use of memory tropes in these films reveals a particular conceptualization or understanding of memory in terms of its relation to the past. And this in turn has implications for recovery. So in Woman in Gold, you see how memory through the flashbacks is employed as a straightforward avenue to the past, especially in a context where counter memory in terms of Maria's memories can be privileged and sort of reveal the quote unquote truths of the past. And while this is very useful in terms of helping to bring about a recovery for Adele, it also becomes complicated because the film does not contend with the problems of highlighting a singular narrative, one person's memories of the past. The reason this is complicated is because it messes with the question of what Adele would have wanted in terms of her legacy. Because through the film, we learn that she did want her images to remain in Austria, but the reason that that could, legally that could be done away with is because her portraits actually belong to her husband. But the film, instead of engaging with this complication of Adele's own agency sort of being denied, it unequivocally celebrates it and sees it as something that's kind of a victory from the point of view of Maria. And because Maria's memories of the past are privileged, she's allowed to speak for Adele in this sense. So you can see how recovery here can only remain incomplete. In Wild Nights with Emily, on the other hand, we've already seen how the film engages with the contingencies of memory, both at the personal and the social and cultural levels. This in turn allows the film to sort of highlight the importance of interrogating, critiquing, and challenging memories as it itself does when it challenges Mabel's narrativization of the past. It also highlights the importance of privileging alternative memories, which again it does by contradicting Mabel's memories of the past and highlighting alternative accounts, such as, for instance, Susan Dickinson's daughter, Martha Dickinson. She is the one who actually gave the first account of Emily and Susan's queer relationship. So this is the narrative that is being prioritized in this film. And yet at the same time, the film does not present Emily's recovery as a fait accompli, essentially suggesting that how deeply Mabel's work in erasing Emily was so successful and how intractable social and cultural memory narratives are, because even today, Emily continues to be seen in terms of this highly reductive image. So here, recovery is left incomplete as an ongoing process, but deliberately. Finally, coming to my conclusion, I return to the argument with which I first began, here divided into two parts. In part one, I have sought to demonstrate that the memory tropes in the films serve to illuminate the various ways memory structures the historical erasure and recovery of women, where on one hand you see in erasure, it may often be entangled with cultural significance of the subjects in terms of how they're positioned within social and cultural memory. And in terms of recovery, we have the film suggesting the importance of prioritizing alternative memories. And through my interpretation of the films, we also access the importance of accounting for memories' relation to the past, with varying degrees of success depending on which film you're approaching. moving further, I further would like to argue that by engaging with the memory tropes and memory itself in this way, the films are able to bring about a final recovery for these two women at the level of reframing cultural memory. My understanding here is that the films, by representing or at least engaging with erasure and recovery, go beyond simply saying, this is who these women were, this is what they did in the past. It goes on to say that this is how they were remembered. This is how they continue to be seen, that this is the kind of changes that took place in the way they were seen, and so on, which is very relevant to understanding their positions within culture more broadly. So in other words, taking into account the historicizing process itself enables a fuller history for these two women and thus a recovery. In terms of cultural memory, I see these films as sort of offering a new mode of commemoration for these two women, allowing audiences to see them rather differently to the way that they have been commemorated in the social and cultural memory narratives that I mentioned. And with this, I come to the end of my paper presentation, and I thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I think now we're going to have to skip one person. So it will be Lucas Martinelli with Políticas Sexuales en el documental argentino reciente. Lucas, the floor is yours.
Bueno, muchas gracias por la participación. Voy a intentar... Ahí está. Bueno, voy a hablar en español. Un segundo. El cine documental argentino tiene una producción muy prolífica y amplia que se ha incrementado en los últimos años. Entre los campos de resonancia que comenzaron a aparecer desde las modalidades temáticas del registro documental, hay un espectro de producciones vinculado con la aparición de las sexualidades. En este sentido, la perspectiva que me interesa indagar sobre el cine documental se vincula con una construcción de una política regional donde la comprensión del género y las sexualidades ocuparon con fuerza otros modos de visibilidad y audibilidad en la esfera pública, particularmente aquello que puede entenderse como democracias sexuales en Occidente. Y además entender algo que pudo haber sido en un comienzo una forma incipiente de denuncia sobre las condiciones de vida vinculadas a las imposiciones del patriarcado y la heteronorma, que son términos que refieren tanto a un sistema de poder de los varones por sobre las mujeres y a la heterosexualidad como modo de vida legítimo, se convirtió con el tiempo en una búsqueda que perdió el carácter interpelativo, característico de los comienzos, hacia una cierta autonomía artística interesada en otras cuestiones del arte, como por ejemplo el uso del material de archivo. Desde el cine de los 2000 hasta el presente, las formas de las intervenciones documentales sobre la sexualidad permearon su carácter de denuncia hacia una deriva de mayor libertad formal y temática. Por las condiciones culturales y sociales del país, fue menos necesario hacer ver o hacer notar una problemática y allí comenzaron a aparecer otro tipo de registros. Para pensar en ese campo de visibilidad, entiendo los documentales como una vinculación de miradas y problemáticas que constituyen los modos de intervención sobre lo real. Los tópicos característicos del cine documental argentino contemporáneo atañen a la historia argentina reciente, particularmente la dictadura del año 76, la guerra de Malvinas, los relatos sobre las historias de vida, las propuestas experimentales, la precariedad económica y social, y este fenómeno que me interesa explorar, que es el vinculado a la sexualidad y el género. El análisis de estos documentales requiere interpretar las maneras en que ciertos temas elaboran diversas relaciones entre el cine y la sociedad, entre una realidad sobre la que echar luz y un discurso estético y audiovisual que la indaga. En estos últimos años, las fronteras entre el documental y la ficción se han mezclado, tensado y superpuesto. Pero la selección del corpus, esto que voy a reseñar ahora, tiene que ver tanto con la posición espectatorial que brindan los films como con el relato de sus realizadores. Una serie de documentales hacen revisionismo histórico e indagan el presente para construir archivos situados en el cambio de régimen de visibilidad y audibilidad. A partir de las tramas, las composiciones, el aparecer de determinados cuerpos, los ritmos narrativos y sus cortes, es posible observar los intersticios espaciales del deseo y ciertas posiciones enunciativas vinculadas a estrategias del género y la identidad sexual que indican el cambio de época y mentalidad respecto a lo que podía considerarse anteriormente. Un trabajo, un antecedente que hallé en este proceso es de Pablo Lanza, de 2019, que observa que hay un tránsito que va de la visibilización de la asunción de la lucha para finalizar con un cuestionamiento del concepto mismo de identidad. Asimismo, Pablo Lanza refiere, luego a analizar diferentes documentales, que, cito, los participantes son agrupados mediante una organización categórica, es decir, según una característica que en este caso es su identidad sexual, son lesbianas o travestis. Esta clasificación se remarca gracias a la exclusividad que los films otorgan a cada colectivo, ya que la mayor parte del corpus no les concede voz a sujetos externos. De esta manera se favorece la construcción de personajes colectivos, aspecto remarcado por la unificación de los discursos y la ausencia de voces disonantes. Cierro la cita. Más allá de esta posibilidad de pensar un conjunto, una conjetura que puedo observar en algunos casos, pero no en todos, me interesa pensar que lo que empieza a aparecer de manera diferente son otras posibilidades de decir y hacer ver, con otro grado de compromiso con las subjetividades y los modos de verlas. Más allá de los planteos de la identidad, que por cierto se diluyen, empiezan a aparecer otros rasgos novedosos. Entonces, si yo pudiera buscar una obra que dé cuenta del carácter incipiente de esas producciones, me gustaría comenzar con la otra, de Lucrecia Martel, un cortometraje de 1989, que se basa en entrevistas a diferentes transformistas, un término que en español se diferencia del drag queen y de travesti, que es la imagen que estoy compartiendo. La canción Se dice de mí, interpretada por Tita Merelo, recorre todo el cortometraje en el que diferentes entrevistadas dan cuenta de lo que es ser transformista, aquel que se viste con ropas del sexo opuesto, a diferencia de lo que es ser travesti, la persona que tiene una identidad de género diferente a la que se le asignó al nacer. Digo, lo que es muy interesante de este registro es que es una película un cortometraje muy incipiente, que da cuenta de algo que después va a aparecer en los diferentes documentales de manera mucho más explícita y específica, y mi hipótesis de lectura es que esto se va convirtiendo cada vez en otra deriva que llega a ser, pierde su carácter de denuncia y se transforma en una exposición mucho más estética. O sea, sin perderlo, sigue siendo política, pero de otra manera. Lesbianas de Buenos Aires, que es una película documental de 2004 de Santiago García, y a ver, es la imagen siguiente, construyó una indagación testimonial coral sobre las experiencias de mujeres en la ciudad que abrió algo de una visibilidad común. A partir de entrevistas a distintas lesbianas, esta película mostró algo que no era común de ser visto en ese momento, que son las lesbianas en el cine. Para mí es una de las primeras películas del 2000 que vuelve a aparecer algo. Y el año siguiente, en el 2005, Hotel Gondolín, que es de Fernando López Escriba, desde una narración de corte mucho más institucional, documenta ese momento histórico en el que lo político se juega con la construcción de una ciudadanía travesti y transexual, en un sitio muy emblemático para la ciudad de Buenos Aires y que tiene que ver con ese hotel que sirvió de refugio para personas trans, que es el Hotel Gondolín. Esto es también interesante porque la lectura que estoy pensando tiene en cuenta la ley de matrimonio igualitario, que fue en el año 2010, y la ley de identidad de género, que fue en el año 2012. Entonces, estas películas vienen a mostrar algo de ese antes. Se dio una expansión de los documentales que retratan a las travestis. Por ejemplo, Furia Travesti, Una historia de trabajo, de Amparo González Aguilar, en el año 2010, Fiesta con amigues, de Pablo Oliverio, 2013, Tacos altos en el barro, de Rolando Pardo, 2014, Madame Butterfly, de Karina Sama, 2015, y T, de Juan Tawil, de 2016. En todos estos casos se trató de documentales institucionales que buscaron retratar las vidas de las comunidades trans y en los que aparecen como fundamentales la condena a la prostitución como única vía de subsistencia. También es destacable que se trata de documentales que fueron realizados con pocos recursos económicos y ya no en la ciudad de Buenos Aires, sino en distintas provincias también. Luego me interesaría señalar 3 documentales que en este panorama construyen retratos de personajes, o sea, retratos de personas, pero lo hacen a partir de la intervención artística, la interacción performativa y las entrevistas. Utilizan estos 3 recursos. El primero es Rosa Patria, que es un documental de 2010 de Santiago Loza, que es un ensayo sobre la vida del poeta y teórico Néstor Perlonger, que es central para todo lo que tiene que ver con los estudios queer en Argentina particularmente. Y lo que va a hacer también es a partir de la intervención artística de las entrevistas a distintas personas y la cuestión de la interacción del documentalista, va a construir un retrato de Néstor Perlonger. Otro retrato es el de Batato Barea en la peli de Batato de 2011 de Goyo Anchú, que es la búsqueda de la mítica vida del clown travesti literario de la década del 80, Batato Barea, que es una revisión en clave de ese presente de este artista que ya hoy configura un mito y que está siendo revisitado por distintas galerías de Buenos Aires, particularmente el Museo Malva. Y luego un documental de carácter mucho más ensayístico, que es Ante la Ley, el retrato prohibido de Carlos Correas, que es del 2012, de Emiliano Gelisier y Pablo Kleppenbach, sobre el escritor y teórico maldito Carlos Correas. Luego de esto tenemos documentales observacionales de Manuel Abramovic que componen retratos de actualidad, por ejemplo con el registro de un personaje muy sexualizado en Soldado, que es un documental de 2017, donde va a haber una trama sobre el cuerpo masculino en el ejército. Hay toda una transgresión con el espacio militar en el cual el documentalista se va acercando a esos cuerpos. Digo, acá no aparece algo ligado directamente a la identidad, sino que aparece algo ligado a una mirada, más allá de pensar el retrato, sino que hay una sexualización de la mirada. Y luego una trama donde lo sexual va de manera directa, desde voces over que acompañan el rostro de los trabajadores sexuales en Blue Boy, que es este cortometraje de 2019. Y en ese arco temporal van a aparecer otras películas, 2017, que para mí 2017-2019 aparecen muchas películas particulares, como Monger de Jeff Zorrilla, que muestra un aspecto poco explorado, que son los clientes de las prostitutas en una ciudad de Buenos Aires, a plena luz del día, en un recorrido que alterna entre 3 personajes. Va a plantear un recorrido por 3 consumidores de prostitutas en la ciudad. Luego tenemos Full Boy, que es un documental observacional de 2014 de Martín Farina, sobre un plantel de fútbol cargado de erotismo y vistas que recorren los cuerpos masculinos. Pero la película que más me interesa de Martín Farina es Mujer Nómade, que es una película de 2018, que es del mismo director, y aparece Esther Díaz, que es una filósofa que expone descarnadamente su exploración profunda del dolor y el sufrimiento en su retrato documental. Allí la particularidad son algunos de los planteos de las filósofas sobre Foucault y Deleuze, pero particularmente sus incursiones sexuales por fuera de la normatividad etaria. Es una mujer mayor que desea muchachos más jóvenes y hacia el final construye una serie de escenas que ponen en escena y práctica la cuestión de la pornografía o su deriva del posporno, ¿no? Como la idea de la tensión de la pornografía. No sé cómo estoy de tiempo. Sí, se lo pueden...
12.
Ok. Entonces, para ir viendo si sí o no, pero digo, después tenemos Miserere, que es una película de 2019, que lo que hace es observar diferentes prostitutos, otra vez digo, me interesa como esa otra perspectiva, que va observando diferentes, testimonios a partir de muchas imágenes en una estación de la ciudad de Buenos Aires que conecta con su entorno urbano, que es la estación de la Plaza Miserere, que con un registro así mucho más calmo y tranquilo, que también hace referencia a Néstor Perlonger de algún otro modo, como una de la tesis de maestría de Néstor Perlonger fue O negocio d'Omillet, que significa el negocio acá se tradujo como el negocio del deseo, pero es la idea del negocio el asunto del prostituto masculino. Entre todos estos, o sea, para mí el caso emblemático lo constituye la cineasta Agustina Comedy, con El silencio es un cuerpo que cae, de 2017, y Playback, ensayo de una despedida, de 2019, porque en ambos films plantea la recuperación de archivos audiovisuales y de comunidades que quedaron marginadas en el tiempo como modo de escribir un presente en el que las miradas sobre esos cuerpos y esos modos de desear se han modificado. Sobre El silencio es un cuerpo que cae, Gabriel Giorgi escribió que en una de las escenas más agudas del film, Comedy, cito, se sitúa en la relación al padre. En el momento en que ella habla de su propia bisexualidad, vemos imágenes de la doma de caballos. Me voy a poner una imagen. Vemos un caballo domado, por el contrario, vemos la fragilidad insistente del cuerpo de los domadores ante esa fuerza imperiosa, se vuelven figuras nítidas de esa novela familiar que no termina de controlar ni modelar la sexualidad, de ese exceso que ya no puede ser docilizado. Es una escena muy pregnante de la película de Comedy en la cual el padre cae de un caballo y, el padre está muerto y ella hace una recuperación de archivo por medio de videos de familiares. Y ese es el recurso que resulta interesante. Es una película que en Argentina tuvo mucha repercusión y que fue completamente... se escribió mucho sobre ella, fue completamente replicada y leída, y para mí eso da cuenta un poco de este carácter de expansión y de corrimiento de algo que se presentó de una manera incipiente, como mucho más temática, hacia algo que tiene mucho más fuerza por la forma en que se lo presenta. Sigo leyendo a Giorgi. En esta escena, la directora evoca las palabras de un psicólogo a su padre que le aseguró que no era 100% homosexual y que podía luchar contra esos impulsos. Ejemplos de las terapias de conversión sí, que ahora vuelven con fuerza devastadora de la mano de sectores evangélicos. Y luego las palabras de su propia psiquiatra que le asegura que, por su bisexualidad, nunca podrá ser feliz. Padre e hija en esa doma que nunca consigue docilizar las fuerzas que recorren los cuerpos. Es allí, precisamente, donde la directora se sitúa a sí misma. Allí habla de su sexualidad y ahí marca que lo que la novela familiar del presente ya no puede ignorar, que la sexualidad de los padres, de las madres, no se acomoda, nunca se acomodó a la heteronorma. Es la memoria de ese desacomodamiento, la fuerza de su dislocación y también las huellas y los daños de su falla lo que el documental trabaja. Junto a la figura del secreto, de la represión, el documental registra también la fuerza, el aliento de un desorden en el que nos reconocemos en el presente. Más allá de Comedy en el archivo, esto vuelve a aparecer en el archivo de la memoria trans, que es una serie documental que se está presentando en este momento en Argentina, que realizó Agustina Comedy y Mariana Bomba, que tiene que ver con la recuperación de un archivo de las imágenes de las travestis que se fueron pasando entre sí y es realmente un objeto de recuperación y que da cuenta de la vulnerabilidad de la situación de las travestis. Por último, Obscena es un cortometraje de Paloma Orlandini Castro, 2021, que estrenó este año, que plantea el acercamiento a la pornografía por parte de una chica que rememora sus recuerdos de infancia. Esta es una de las imágenes que tiene que ver con cómo ella imita una performance de un artista que vio en un libro de arte que se ponía billetes en la vagina y demás, pero lo que tiene interesante es que es como una vuelta hacia la cuestión pornográfica y una reflexión sobre eso, otra tangente para pensar la cuestión de la sexualidad. Bueno, para finalizar, el campo del documental está en transformación y constante ebullición, los límites de lo mostrable se han transformado en los últimos tiempos y dan lugar a maneras de mirar y oír. Los límites de lo aceptable se han corrido y los films exploran otras incursiones. Entre ellas, el archivo como tema y materialidad es el sustento más original, como un mandato de los feminismos que llaman a hacer genealogías y repensar todo desde perspectivas críticas. Así que bueno, muchas gracias.
Obrigado. Thank you so much for your presentation. Now we move forward to GVGK Tang with the presentation, The Past is Present, Excavating Memory and Identity Through Early Trans Queer Film. The floor is yours.
Thanks. Is my screen showing up?
Yes.
Just a content warning before I begin. I'll be sharing clips throughout this presentation, and some of them are sexually suggestive. Let's time travel. It's 1929, and we're watching The Surprise of the Night, directed by Oscar Wilde, without an E, an obvious pseudonym. Where are we? Who are we? Why are we watching this film? A title card tells us this is a picture told in action and not words. In the first shot, we find our protagonist, a white femme, preening in her boudoir. Through a series of jump cuts, we watch as she plays with her hair, adjusts her bosom, and gazes into a hand mirror. She proceeds to lift her skirts, revealing she's without underwear. She brushes off her mons, emphasizing the flatness of her front. The titular knight, a white man in a suit, emerges from behind a curtained entryway. He greets our protagonist with a knowing smile, momentarily gazing into the camera, or just behind it, as if seeking the approval of his voyeurs. Then both performers look to us, before exchanging kisses. After playfully swatting the knight for trying to lift her skirts, our protagonist pours drinks. While making out, the knight gets handsy again, concentrating on the protagonist's chest and groin. The protagonist shoos him away, in a dramatic huff, wagging her finger and stifling breathless laughter with a grin. After some extended dancing and frotting in the boudoir, the couple returns to the couch. In one scene, the protagonist fillets the knight, though his pants remain on. In another, the knight gropes at the protagonist's chest over her dress and rubs at her groin. The couple proceeds to either frot, have intercrural or penetrative sex. It's left rather vague. All we know is the knight keeps his boxers on and the protagonist's butt is exposed. At one point, they pause and the protagonist wiggles her behind playfully as the knight sits to the side, attempting to hide a fit of laughter by turning his head away. After the fun has ended, the knight disappears and we are left to gaze at the protagonist standing in her boudoir once again. This time, when she lifts her dress, a title card announces "Surprise" in capital letters. She spreads her legs to reveal penis and swivels her hips dramatically as if to emphasize its presence. After messily grabbing at the layers of her skirt and dancing half naked by herself, the knight reappears to help the protagonist undress. After shedding these trappings of femininity, her dress and bra, the protagonist impatiently waves off the filmmaker, director, perhaps even us, the viewers. Smiling and clumsily pulling off a stocking, she mugs for the camera by making a silly hand gesture. The last shot is a close-up of a white man in a suit. It's the protagonist, gazing at us, smiling and laughing one last time. Surprise is the earliest extant American film to document trans queer sex. Held at the Kinsey Institute without provenance, its acquisition mysteriously attributed to an anonymous donor. Sequestered away in the collections and low-quality digital copies only made available to scholars by appointment, Surprise's information-rich content belies its lack of accessibility, both physically and contextually. Who produced the film, and for whom was it produced? How, where, and why? The issues made evident by surprise allow us to explore methods of interpretation. Those we may adapt to critically read similar materials within a broader history of film, pleasure politics, and transqueer experiences. Drawing on Saidiya Hartman's method of critical fabulation, we recognize what we do not or cannot know, and in turn must complicate and contest linear narratives based on select sources. Drawing on Miquel-Rolf-Troyot's idea of historicity 1 and 2, what happened and what is said to have happened, we recognize film as both historical and mythical, liminal and folkloric in quality. This presentation treats surprise as an entry point into a discussion on the gaps and silences of archives. The film's amateur production and vernacular style allow for the excavation of transqueer memory and meaning-making. Transqueer pornographies are documentaries because they capture queer sex as it happens. Surprise and antique docuporn acts as both a primary and secondary source that troubles popular notions of transqueer identity in the early 20th century. Beginning in the 1800s and continuing into the interwar period, transqueer activists in the West gave name to their experiences using identifiers to invoke kindred desires and presentations. For transqueer communities at the turn of the century, gender and sexuality were experienced in tandem. An attraction to men was considered an inherently feminine attribute, such that one might have a male body, but a female sex drive or psyche. Straddling modern conceptions of gay, trans, and intersex identities, they referred to themselves as earnings, inverts, fairies, third sex, and sexual intermediaries. Hetero-homo dichotomies were different than they are today, not just based on one's embodied sex, but on gendered presentation and sexual behavior. Among sex workers, fairies were femme, would dress like women to entice masculine and seemingly straight clients. Trade, as they were known, were the active partners in these arrangements, and as such maintained so-called normal masculine identity as the non-penetrated party. Pre-code Hollywood introduced audiences to a variety of white transqueer characters alongside racist caricatures. From 1914's A Florida Enchantment to 1932's Call Her Savage, which featured Hollywood's first depiction of a gay bar, so-called pansy comedy was a rising fashion in the West. As a Variety film critic put it in 1932, the male magnolia is getting the play. Effeminate boys creeped occasionally into motion pictures before. Winked at, they are now apparently the stock comedy business easiest at hand. Though these representations were spectacle tailored for cishet audiences, making light of a mob scorn or offering a glimpse into intimate counterpublics, they were also fleeting acknowledgments of transqueer existence. Across the pond, a decade before Surprise's production, German sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld began producing a series of so-called social hygiene films, one of which would come to be known as the first or earliest extant film to explicitly deal with transqueer issues. In a campaign to decriminalize sodomy and destigmatize various sexuality-related issues, Hirschfeld saw film as a vehicle for education and public welfare. In the work of enlightenment that film performs so well, science has found a powerful ally in its fight for justice. In juxtaposition to depictions of transqueer eroticism and femininity, different from the others, was created in service to transqueer respectability politics. Our two main characters are relatively masked, and their intimacy is innocently conveyed through longing gazes, gentle caresses, and hand-holding. By the end, the protagonist meets an untimely demise, and his young lover mourns him, or Hirschfeld preachily advises him through knowledge to justice. Sexual intermediaries are treated as scientific subjects, courtesy of a Hirschfeld lecture partway through the film, but they are never depicted, except in the background of two gay bar scenes. Though he advises the audience that, apart from man and woman, there are also men with womanly physical and psychological traits, and even displays photographs of nude crossdressers, the discussion is highly clinical. Even still, the film didn't escape the notice of Weimar censors, with screening shut down within months. Not too long after, the Nazis burned it, among other materials from Hirschfeld's Institute. The film only exists as a fragment today. In lieu of turn-of-the-century activist treatises and medical ethnographies, we find a silent visual memoir created by and for transqueer people, Ina Lynch's 2018 article on Different from the Others notes the shaping of queer pasts and presents into progressive teleologies not only obscures the subjective, often nameless experiences of historical actors, but also covers over complex, affective registers. As such, I argue that pornography lends itself well to transqueer history's archive of feeling. Surprise, in particular, offers an intimate glimpse into the lives of two transqueer people, even as characters in a dramatic role play. It does not seek to convince its audience of anything. It simply exists in anonymity, much like its actors. Surprise allows transqueers to be silly and unexceptional and find pleasure in each other's company. Pleasure being the operative word. How do we locate pleasure in a transqueer archive of feeling? Because pleasure is neither a subject of respectability nor mockery. What's surprising about surprise? Not that the protagonist has a penis, because the reveal is anticlimactic after so heated a love scene, and the titular knight is nowhere to be found. There's no big reaction shot, no shock or dismay, just fits of giggles and tenderness. Clumsily disrobing, mugging for the camera, our protagonist shoos us away, telling us not to dwell in fantasy behind the curtains of her home or our makeshift theaters. Maybe that's what's most surprising about surprise. Excavating pleasure in an age of isolation, tangible in its intimacy, a gift to experience transqueer joy by proxy from a screen, just as it was 100 years ago. Surprise is a palimpsest of memory and meaning-making. Performers invite spectatorship. They seek to share their desires through action and not words, as promised in the first of the only two intertitles. It is a motion picture manifesto, an unapologetic expression and declaration of sexuality, selfhood, and transqueer identity. The raunchy medium is selected and fashioned with intent, feeling as memory and a statement. I'm here and beautiful and rapturous. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I think we can move to the Q&A. It was a pleasure to listen to all of you. Thank you again for sharing your work with us. If you have questions, you can write it on the chat, or you can do it directly if you want. I think we have already one from Miguel. I can quote. It's to Ana Viegas. I found Ana Viegas talks very insightful. It reminded me about the panel regarding gender in film, Eyes Wide Shut, because it's based on the book Traum novel that depicts Viennese high society. I was wondering, could you elaborate on the difference between gender roles in the high society and low society currently and in the past? Are there any difference, and what has remained the same?
Okay, thank you, Miguel, for your question. I think I'd like to answer this question by going back to my films. So in Women in Gold, you see how Adele, as much as she is a Jewish woman, she's also a rich Jewish woman. So we see that, you know, she has access to education, she has access to art, she's allowed to sort of engage with her position as a woman through all of these things. And I would also like to talk about Emily, because she too is an upper class woman, so to speak. She belongs to Amherst high society. And one can even argue that it's because she is rich and she has family sort of resources behind her. She has the freedom to actually write and become this prolific poet that we know today. So I think the word that comes to mind here is privilege. It's a word that's quite prevalent today when we talk about things quite casually. But I think here it's their privilege that allows them to do the things that they do. And as much as they are restricted in terms of gender roles, they definitely they do have advantages, say, over the women who maybe worked for them in their houses. They too would have not just gender roles to contend with in terms of, you know, what kind of work they could do, but also class restrictions in terms of how much access to resources they had. I would also like to bring in the idea of intersectionality here again, because say with Adele, like, she is a Jewish woman, so her experiences would definitely differ from a non-Jewish woman. And with Emily's, the understanding is that she was queer, so we can see how she's read through a heteronormative framework. At the same time, they're a rich Jewish woman on the one hand and a rich queer woman on the other hand. So they would definitely, again, be able to do things that, say, a poor women or low class women might not have been able to do, even if they did share the experience of being a Jew or being queer. So I think so when it comes to talking about gender roles across class, across time, in terms of the past and the present, it's very important to take into consideration all of these kind of intersections. I think that's why intersectionality has become so predominant in gender studies today, because it's understood that gender roles are not something that are static or they're extremely multiplicitous, they're very diverse, and this would also even have implications on memory in terms of who remembers the past and how memories themselves can be interrogated. And in terms of the second part of this question, are there any differences or what has remained the same? Certainly in terms of, the content of gender roles would definitely have changed in terms of education, work, and so on and so forth. There will definitely be shifts. But I think the overarching idea that there are still sort of barriers in terms of privilege and that that intersectionality remains very relevant is probably even more relevant today, because we're starting to see so many more divisions. They're becoming so much more apparent than they perhaps were to people who lived in the past. So that would be my take on this question. Thank you.
I think we have a comment, a question for GVGK about how long does this all go back, this kind of movies, this representation. Is there any record of something similar that you show us, or it's all gone?
So pornography, specifically transqueer pornography. There's a French film from 1920 that does depict gay sex. It's interesting. It's like a parody of Madame Butterfly. It features Yellowface. There's two versions of it. One is the original French version. The intertitles are very poetical. But then there's an American version that kind of cut it up and kept some of the French titles, but then it also added English ones that are very crass and offensive and really emphasize the racism component. So it's interesting how in these different cultural contexts, how sexuality or homoerotic activity was expected to be received. And so edits were made accordingly.
Thank you. Is there any more questions? Do you want to share with us? I was thinking to Lucas about Lucrecia Martel. If you see some relations in her filmography about the subject you talk about, can you comment something? The sounds we can't hear you. You have to.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes, I can make some links between Lucrecia Martel with the subject that I was talking about, but I think that she works with a point of view that brings these matters into the idea of sexuality and the change of an image of these matters, these issues. But she brings an early position with these trans matters and issues in the 80s. So I think that was a very interesting view about this, but I don't know what else I can say about her, but it's okay.
Thank you. I also have more kind of a question to Anna and Diego about the reconfigure image of the women in film. It is possible, that is in popular perspective, to change the representation through those films or other films. I don't know if you have idea of other films that try to reconfigure the image of women in history. Do you think it's possible to completely change the image or the history of the history that is told normally about these women?
Yes, I would say that it is possible to reconfigure the history. I mean, that's kind of the sort of overarching argument that I try to make in my analysis of these films. Of course, I mean, there are definitely limitations because it's just one form of representation. It's just one, like, films are just one way of addressing the past, and they will have their limitations, they will have their successes. I think the success comes when it's a rather popular film because it has a pretty big audience, and the people who watch it are inevitably led to think a little bit differently if the films try to make a very concerted effort to rewrite the history for these women, to sort of bring them back to the fore. But at the same time, of course, again, cinema has limitations. There are definitely going to be things that are left out, which can make a difference in terms of the politics of this representation. For instance, in the case of Adele, I spoke about how the idea of what she would have wanted, that's kind of glossed over because the film takes a very particular approach to the past. So I think that's probably what we have to look into in any kind of representation of the past. Even attempts to reconfigure histories need to be looked at critically in order to see the ways that they fail in what they purport to do. But yeah, in general, at least, I mean, depending, of course, on the type of film we're talking about, there is a potential to reconfigure these histories in the public domain.
Thank you for your answer. Do you have any more questions about the subject? Do you want to comment something on the presentations? You can write on chat if you want to.
I would actually, I mean, I'm sorry, I could not understand Lucas's presentation because I do not know Spanish, but GVGK Tang's, her presentation, I mean, your presentation is really interesting, the way that you look at pornography and sort of excavate it for, you know, how it functions as memory. That was something that, to me, not being very well versed with pornography studies, that was quite, it was quite illuminative. So yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you. Lucas, I'm sorry I couldn't understand your presentation either, but I really did enjoy the visuals. They were very interesting and I still felt engaged.
I have to make a translation to my work to make understandable. I enjoy a lot your presentations too. Thank you.
I would like to ask a question, if you guys don't mind, regarding history and memory, because you guys are a little bit touching on it. And on the last panel, we were talking about history and memory as well. And I was wondering, how does gender and history and memory and film all correlate all together? I know it's a very broad question, but if you have any words, I'd love to hear them.
I'm sorry, I could not hear the question. I had a problem with my internet. Could you repeat that?
Basically, the question in a nutshell is, I think we're touching here on recurring themes, particularly history, memory, and then gender and film. So these four elements. And I was wondering if you had some words on how these four elements intersect all together.
I have one commentary about that. That is, I started to research with a person that work in that field that connect gender, memory, and film. So to me, it's a very basic net where these fields are connected, because you can understand a political way to watch the films with these ideas of memories, because in Argentina there's a lot of works about memory, specifically with the dictatorships, and this is there's a lot of work and a lot of films about that matter, that trauma and history problem. And there are a lot of work of feminists that research these gender issues in that way. So there's a lot of process of working that connect that fields. So I don't know. I think that there's a way to look at the past that is very feminist way to look the past, because it's a way to look again all the memory process. It's another way to look back, and to me that's very very interesting. I think that Tang working in that way to reserve the archives again and see a different way, something that were in the past. I don't know if you agree or not.
I agree. I think that was a really great point. I was kind of thinking also how film, in terms of history making, can be both a primary and a secondary source. So it's the preservation of that memory in the time it's being made, but also the memories that are being made now as we tell those stories through the film again.
Anna, Viegas, do you like to comment on that, about the memory and the intersection with the history and gender?
I think I would agree with what Lucas said about, like how memory is kind of used in order to approach the past from a more feminist perspective, because it's also, in my readings for this paper, I came across certain understandings from the domain of women's history, especially oral history, wherein the historians not only look at what these women said, but also, how they said it, what they leave out, and, what they tend to focus on, if they focus on things to do with the homestead or to do with their families, or, if they sort of brush over certain, like, not so palatable things about their history. So I think memory, especially when it's narrativized in the context of oral history, it's a kind of history making, because they are trying to make their history for a particular purpose. It's definitely ideological. It's definitely a kind of performance, and I would say that it would have implications for history in terms of looking at the past in a new way, and also looking at how the past sort of continues in the present, in the way that it continues to have its impacts, continues to have its influences on people in the present. So yeah.
Thank you. It's a very good point. Yeah. If there are more questions, I think we can finish the panel. I would like to thank you all for your presence, and to the speakers for their communications and points of view. It was a very compelling panel. Thank you to all. Next at 3 p.m. we will have the next panel in Portuguese called Dispositivos de Memória. And thank you for your presence, and thank you for your work and presentation. It was very, very compelling panel. Thank you.